Glass, new film by M. Night Shyamalan, which is a double sequel. It is a sequel both to Split and to Unbreakable, which is considered by many, and I think I would agree with this, as being M. Night Shyamalan's best film. So do you remember Unbreakable?
No.
Okay, so in Unbreakable, the story is that somebody is involved in a train accident from which they walk away unscathed. And they come, this is Bruce Willis, plays David Dunn, and he comes to believe through his interaction with a character called Elijah Price, played by Samuel L. Jackson, that somehow he's got super strength, that somehow he is a real version of a comic book superhero. And it's a really interesting film because it was a kind of, a postmodern look at comics mythology, asking if you had those, if superpowers existed in the real world, what would they look like? How would they manifest? Okay. So then we had Split, in which James McAvoy plays this character called Kevin Wendell Crumb, who is inhabited by a host of multiple personalities who refer to themselves as the Horde. Did you see Split?
No.
Okay. Again,
that bit when you asked me a question.
No, but there are a lot of films that you've seen recently. You've seen stuff that I haven't seen. So in Unbreakable, Elijah has this theory that comic books are sort of based on real events, and that they're actually reflecting something in the real world, that a version of superheroes exists in the real world. So then in Split, you had James McAvoy, as I said, with this split personality, and the various personalities are all awaiting the arrival of the Beast, which is a personality which would appear to have some form of supernatural strength, but no one's entirely sure. And all the three of these come together in what's now being referred to as the Eastrail trilogy in Glass. And in Glass, what happens is that David Dunn is the hooded vigilante who's prowling the streets in search of wrongdoers who he can spot by brushing against them. He feels that he's got some otherworldly connection to them. His path crosses with that of the Kevin Wendell Crumb character, and indeed with that of the Elijah character, referred to as Mr. Glass because he has these very, very fragile bones. And they are all brought together under the auspices of Dr. Ellie Staple, Sarah Paulson, who has basically said that she's got 3 days in which to convince them that they are all suffering from a delusion. And the delusion that they suffer from is the delusion of grandeur, of believing in comic books, of believing that things that can be explained completely rationally and through science and psychiatry have caused them to believe that somehow they're superheroes.
What's upsetting you, Patricia?
What if he can't do these extraordinary things? What if he is just unwell? Like you?
Everything extraordinary can be explained away, and yet it is true. I think deep down you know this. Everything we will see and do will have a basis in science, but it will have limits. This is the real world, not a cartoon. And yet some of us don't die from bullets. Some of us can still bend steel. That is not a fantasy.
Now, the thing about Shyamalan's work is this. An awful lot of it treads a very thin line, a kind of Spinal Tap line between clever and stupid, okay? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think if you look, for example, I think Lady in the Water is a terrible film. I didn't like The Visit, but many other people did. And I am convinced, or I have come round to the feeling that my reaction to The Visit is more to do with my being fed up with found footage movies than it is to do with the problems of the film itself, because I know a lot of people who do think that The Visit is a much better film than I do. But there are Shyamalan films like The Village, which I really liked, but I know a lot of people lost patience with it. So there's a lot of his work which walks that knife edge between, as I said, between clever and stupid, between yes and no, between oh yeah and between oh for heaven's sake. In the case of this, I think that despite the fact there's a moment in it in which there's a cameo, which is, a badly played cameo, and despite the fact that the exposition is very creaky and that there are things, it would be very easy to laugh at it. And I think from what I generally get about some of the responses, some people have. But I went with it. And I have to say that having gone with it, I found it, I liked it. And the thing it reminded me of was the Jim McBride remake of Abu Dussouf Breathless, starring Richard Gere, is a film which many people laugh at and mock and sneer at. And I really like that film. And I understand exactly why it is that people think it's silly, although actually, weirdly enough, over the years, its reputation has grown enormously. But that is a film which spends a lot of time with a furrowed brow worrying about the real meaning of the Silver Surfer, okay? And I've always loved that film, and I understand why some people don't, but I think they're wrong. And I think there is a tonal comparison, weirdly, although the films are very different, between Glass and that remake of Breathless, because it has that same sense of if you go with it and you buy into its central conceit. I actually thought it worked. I mean, in some ways, it has the same kind of psychobabble that's present in a lot of films that I really like Shock Corridor or Ninth Configuration or Shutter Island. These are all films, which trade in split personality and this, that, and the other, and very little relation to actual science, but they do it in a way that works, and it works dramatically for me, and I really, really like them. There's also the interesting thing with Shyamalan. Shyamalan's always had this kind of weird obsession with The Exorcist, which I understand. There's a bit in Sixth Sense in which somebody asks him if he is Jerry Friedkin, and there's a joke in Split in which one of the multiple personalities of the Horde says everybody knows that the priest dies at the end of The Exorcist. But more importantly here is there appeared to me to be quite a large dose of Blatty's Legion of Exorcist 3. Everything from the kind of, the elaborate sort of asylum setting to the quasi-scientific theory behind, explaining away what's actually happening to do with, multiple personalities. And, right down to the idea of, in Exorcist 3, we have Mrs. Clelia crawling on the ceiling. Is that supernatural? Did it actually happen? Are we imagining it? There is something of the tone of Exorcist 3 about this. And, if you compare it to, films like the X-Men films, which again are films about outsiders who are, shunned by society because they come to believe something about themselves. In the end, what this comes down to is it's a story about, do they believe in this comic book mythology? Have they become somehow obsessed by the comic book mythology? Or is there some kind of real thing where there's a conversation in which a character talks about, the spandex. He said, that came from wrestlers, from circus acts, from strongmen acts, which is true. And there's also discussion about the fact that in the very early Superman comics, Superman couldn't fly because he couldn't. He could just leap tall buildings at a single bound for quite a long time until he turned into flying, which was always a weird one. Anyway, I am not a comic book nerd. I don't know much about comic books. I know enough to be sort of fascinated by some areas of them. I thought this was Shyamalan's best film since Signs, and I think in order for it to work, you have to go with it, and I did go with it, and I really enjoyed it.